Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's Stimson Center Dialogue, After Caracas, a new U.S. posture in the Americas and what it means for China and Russia. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Latin America program here at the Stimson Center. Today's conversation involves colleagues from our China and Russia programs, and I'm so grateful for their participation and support. In 2023, Beijing announced a quote, all-weather strategic partnership between China and Venezuela, where it has loaned $59 billion since establishing close ties to the late Hugo Chavez government 2 decades ago. Last month, on January 3rd, Zhou Xiaoqi, China's senior diplomat for Latin America, met at the presidential palace in Caracas with Chavez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, to build on that friendship. Just hours later, however, U.S. Delta Force commandos shot their way into Maduro's compound, seized Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, and brought them to New York City to stand trial for drug smuggling. That intervention was a blow to China and Russia, another longtime partner of Venezuela. And it was not by coincidence. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has justified the raid by describing Venezuela as a, quote, operating hub for China and Russia. President Trump's message to Beijing and Moscow was even more blunt. We don't want you there. You're not going to be there. The reversal of fortune for the U.S. adversaries suggested the White House was serious in its national security strategy that was released last November. The document announced a return of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, only this time presumably designed to elbow China and Russia out of the Western Hemisphere instead of European monarchies. It said the United States would, quote, deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. But China and Russia, of course, also get a vote, and neither has yet offered to leave the United States alone in its would-be sphere of influence. In fact, earlier this month, China complained bitterly when Panama's Supreme Court, under U.S. pressure, canceled a contract for a Chinese company to operate ports at the Panama Canal. Beijing warned that Panama would, quote, pay a heavy price. For its part, Russia has accused the United States of, quote, suffocating Cuba, another historic Russian ally in the Western Hemisphere, by interrupting the oil deliveries that keep the island's sputtering economy afloat. What can we learn from the reaction so far by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin to the U.S. raid on Venezuela and the broader reassertion of U.S. power in Latin America? What is the strategic value for China and Russia of their diplomatic and economic relationships in this region? Are they willing to pull up stakes? And if so, in return for what U.S. concessions in their own regions, in their own would-be spheres of influence? If they will not go willingly, is the United States capable and willing to force them out, perhaps by outcompeting them for influence, or by coercing Latin American leaders to diminish or even cut ties? And finally, and importantly, what do Latin Americans think? What do they want from their relationships with China and Russia? How do they view Washington's quest for hemispheric preeminence? To answer these and other questions, I'm so delighted to be joined today by three terrific experts. Dmitry Rosenthal, director of the Institute for Latin American Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences, who joins us from Moscow. Sylvia Colombo, a reporter at Folha de São Paulo, who joins us from São Paulo. And my Stimson Center colleague, Yoon Soon, a senior fellow and co-director of our East Asia program. Welcome to all three of you. For members of our audience on Zoom, please know that you are also part of this conversation. We invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the discussion. Please feel free to send them just as soon as they arise. If time permits at the end or maybe earlier, we'll do our best to address as many of them as possible. With that, I want to start our conversation with you, Dmitry, if I could, and ask your views of the strategic calculations at play here in Moscow, how the Russian government sees what occurred in Venezuela, but really more broadly, What is the value of Russia's investments and relationships throughout Latin America? What's at stake now that the United States is trying explicitly to diminish Russia's power, influence, and relationships throughout Latin America and the Caribbean?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for your invitation. For me, it's a pleasure to be here and to express my thoughts about the situation in Venezuela and in Latin America. But I have to say that I don't represent Russian government, and I will express only my personal point of view. And I think now it's very complicated, it's very difficult to analyze the situation in Venezuela, because we are observing, as I think, two controversial tendencies. From the one hand, the American military operation has changed a lot of things. And now we are observing a very deep reconstruction of Venezuelan political and economic system. What do I mean? I mean that we are observing some new laws, for example, hydrocarbon laws, the new broad amnesty is in the process. And I think that it's possible to imagine that our assets in Venezuela are under the risk. And according to our foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, Russian companies are squeezed out from Venezuela. But from the other hand, I think that our assets are protected by the agreements between Moscow and the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, which is represented now by Delcy Rodriguez. Moreover, I think Russian companies contribute to social and economic development of Venezuela. And in past, for example, a considerable part of Venezuelan opposition expressed desire to continue cooperation with Russia. I think now the situation is unpredictable, but the economic problems is only one part of this situation. Another part is the political problems. Because for Moscow, Caracas was a very important Latin American ally. And according to our concept of foreign policy, there are four main allies of Russia in Latin America. They are Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil, and Venezuela. And for us, the situation is very complicated because in the beginning of the century, I think, Venezuela was I think we can use this word, a gate to Latin America for Russia. And now we have a very deep and very good military cooperation, cultural cooperation, and because of the situation with American military operation, I think we can revise the level of our cooperation. It's not good for us. Certainly, it's not good for us. But despite some pessimistic thoughts, I think that Russia is going to keep its presence in Latin America, and I think we have our adventures in different areas, in nuclear areas, in industry, in space investigation, in digitalization, some others. And I think that Russia is able to cooperate with Latin American countries in all forms of cooperation. So I think I have some optimistic thoughts in the last of my speech.
Many thanks, Dmitry. Yoon, a similar question for you, but maybe before asking it a teeny bit of context, which is we often group Russia and China together when talking about their roles as external actors in the Americas, but it's worth acknowledging that China's role is much deeper. Its commercial and economic relationships are more profound. It's the leading trading partner for much of South America. And over the last 20 years, it has accumulated enormous diplomatic weight throughout the hemisphere. And with that said, what's your view of how China sees its relationships in the region evolving, if at all, now that the United States has made very clear that it would prefer the region not deepen and, in fact, significantly lessen its contact with the Chinese government?
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you for the great question. Well, to answer the question, I think first it's a definition about what kind of power China is, right? China has been a regional power. It is now aiming for the global presence. It has achieved a global economic presence. But in terms of military power, security presence, I would say China is still very much likely behind. Like you pointed out, therefore, China's existence in Latin America has primarily taken place in the context of commercial engagement, infrastructure development, some of the mining cooperation, agricultural cooperation. But that also means that for China, the political influence associated with China's presence comes primarily from the economic domain, which raises this question that when we talk about sphere of influence and this concept of Monroe Doctrine, how is economic influence or economic presence defined or framed in that context? Because US dominance in Western Hemisphere in the Chinese definition does not necessarily equate to exclusivity. It does not preclude China's economic engagement with countries in the region. And honestly, I do perceive that there is a regional demand for deeper economic engagement with China because China can offer technology, China can offer financing, China can offer efficient and effective infrastructure development where it sees is as necessary. So there's a demand and there's a supply. If US wants to artificially impose a doctrine that says, China, this is my backyard and you cannot be here, I think the question that US will get back is, well, what do you mean not be here? And does that mean that Chinese companies cannot be here? Does that mean that China cannot be involved in the local security cooperation? I think it gets into a process of deliberation. And this is actually, I think, it's already happening. This debate about sphere of influence is no longer defined in a geographical term. But instead, there's an emerging tendency to see it as sphere of influence in terms of functional areas, in terms of domains. Like, for example, some scholars have made the observation that China should be allowed to invest in Latin America, but not in certain sectors, such as telecommunication or infrastructure sector that is critical to what US perceives to be its own security interest. So I think that requires much more careful debate and deliberation about what sphere of influence really constitute and how it is defined.
Excellent, Yun. Thanks so much. Sylvia, I'm going to ask you at certain points questions broadly about South America, Latin American views, but I do want to start just talking about Brazil if we could. It's the largest economy in the region, and it has a great deal of influence of how the regional reactions to the Monroe Doctrine are viewed by other external actors, including China and Russia. What I have seen is very little indication that the Brazilian government is willing to cut ties. We've seen, in fact, the president of Brazil show increasing interest in the BRICS grouping, which is anchored by China and Russia, and even discuss maybe a free trade agreement with China. So I'm wondering if that is the right impression, or have you really seen any pivot whatsoever in the way Brazil is treating China and Russia?
Yeah, I think I will divide my answer in two very small parts. I think geopolitically, Lula would be very much fond of supporting Venezuela and supporting Maduro since the beginning of this actual mandate. But the opposition was so hard against him and so against it, and also other countries of the region like Uruguay of Lacagepou, but anyway, Chile. I would say that only Colombia would have more connections with the view of Lula about what to do with Venezuela. But a lot of people got it's very divided. A lot of people got very angry about the way the Brazilian government didn't act quickly or act more outspoken when the elections were frauded in 2024. Brazil was there with its chancellor and didn't put any remarks, any negative remarks on what had happened. So Lula, as he won the election by only 1 million vote, which is a little bit in Brazil, makes him trapped. So he's not doing a lot nowadays, and this is what I most hear on reprehension or criticism from the Venezuelan opposition. Lula should be doing more things. Lula should, it's the leader of South America, although he isn't, but I mean, Brazil is the biggest economy. So Maduro became a problem for him. So in this sense, I don't think Brazil would take a strong position, although it has condemned the invasion and the kidnapping of Maduro. On the other hand, what I can tell you, you guys are intellectuals, you work with the subject, but I'm just a reporter, and what I can tell you about what I saw, because I just came back from Venezuela. I went there on January 4. I got there January 5, and it was a very tense and weird situation in which you found a lot of Venezuelans against the invasion, but when you see the numbers, most of them were in favor of the invasion. So I think this is going to be a real tough question for Brazil in our local politics, because Lula depends a lot still of a basis of ideological basis of left-wing supporters that doesn't want to criticize Maduro anyway, and who are really against what Trump is doing. So this is something that I think it will be a challenge for Lula. We have elections next year. Venezuela, it is a subject, yeah. And on the other hand, on my attempt to enter Venezuela, which I could do like 3 or 4 days after, and a little bit in a clandestine way, I must say, through trochas and things like this. Mostly the Venezuelans I found were very upset about the invasion anyway. Not that they preferred Chavez or Maduro, but really upset about the way things are going now to be managed by the US. So I think it's a real complicated question for Brazil, and it is going to be an issue on the elections next year in October. It is really going to be an issue. We have a lot of migrants. We have more and more migrants from Venezuela getting here. There are more in Colombia, but here we have a lot as well, almost 1 million. And so this is going to influence a lot what can happen in the elections. I could not make any assumptions about Russia and China, because I really don't know these connections very well to talk about. My work is more on the field, you know. So what I can tell you is that there are a lot of confusion, and I met a lot of Venezuelans who were very, very angry about what's going on after January the 3rd.
Many thanks, Sylvia. Dimitri, we're trying to understand, the motives from the perspective of Moscow and Beijing when it comes to Latin America. Historically, we thought and would talk about Russia and the region as promoting kind of a shared socialist ideology in places like Venezuela. And it seems like that's not really a core pillar of Russia's foreign policy anymore. So kind of delving more deeply into the motivations, how much of it is ideology at this point, if at all, in what drives these relationships? Or is it more the idea of showing the United States that Russia can be disruptive in the United States sphere of influence, and reminding the United States maybe to be less disruptive in places closer to Russia? Is it more a question of the energy sector, as you alluded to in your first response, and the interests of Russian companies in places like Venezuela? What, if anything, is ideology doing in this conversation?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very complicated question. Do you have a time? Because I can speak a lot about this. I think that there was a very big evolution of Russian position toward Venezuela. And in the beginning of this century, I think that Moscow didn't consider Venezuela as a political ally. We were looking for some new markets, and we were selling arms to Venezuela. Our oil companies produced oil in this state. And what is most important, we were trying to not provoke United States in the first part of this century. But after the beginning of our confrontation with Western countries, Moscow began to demonstrate our political presence in Latin America and our military presence. For example, I can say about some military training, joint military training with Russian aircraft, which can take nuclear arms. I remember the very huge scandal after the training in 2008, but there was another story. In 2010, there was another training with Russian aircrafts in Nicaragua, but the base for these aircrafts was in Venezuela. And during the flight from Venezuela to Nicaragua, Russian aircrafts crossed the airspace of Colombia. It was a very huge scandal. Russian embassy was trying to explain that it was a mistake. Sorry for this. But when they returning to from Nicaragua to Venezuela, they crossed Colombian airspace once again, just to show we are here. And for us, it was a very important ally during the Chavez period. There were very good personal relations between Vladimir Putin and Hugo Chavez. But if we are going to speak about the present time, about the last 10 years, unfortunately, I can say that Venezuela was in a very deep economic crisis. The oil production was in crisis. Our trade was about 200 million per year, 100 million per year. And for us, Venezuela wasn't a very good economic partner. But Moscow always considered Venezuela as a political ally, especially in the conflict with the collective West. And because of this situation, this context, we were trying to keep our presence in this state, and we are trying to support the government of Maduro. Another important thing, I think that in the situation of our conflict with Western countries, after the starting of the special military operation, military conflict in Ukraine, it was very hard for us to cooperate with Western countries in Europe. And we needed to find some partners in Latin America. And that's why, for us, this region was very important and still is very important.
Many thanks, Dmitry. Yun, the Chinese foreign policy making, at least for me, can be somewhat non-transparent. And so it's a bit difficult for us to discern just how much China might at any moment be prioritizing the Western Hemisphere. And particularly, it's been a bit challenging to figure out just how disturbed China might be by this reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, by the emergence of the Monroe Doctrine. I'm wondering if you can help us read the tea leaves a bit about how China's reaction maybe has evolved since January 3rd and the U.S. Abduction of Nicolás Maduro, since the release last November of the United States National Security Strategy, followed by the release of a similar document in China. What has been your interpretation? Has China been defensive about its posture in the region? Is it willing to have this as a point of conflict and tension with the United States? Is it prioritizing other aspects of this enormously complex and important relationship? How has it changed, if at all, since last November, since January 3rd, the way Xi Jinping and China more broadly has been responding to the United States' new policies in the Americas?
Thank you, Ben. I think this is a really important aspect to understand how China has calculated its response to the raid. As we have seen, Beijing's first reaction, the most direct reaction, was much more dramatic and it was much more vehement. But you also saw that Beijing calmed down relatively quickly. On the diplomatic rhetoric side, we saw strong condemnations and criticisms on U.S. unilateral attack that violates, in the Chinese definition, violates the basic principle of sovereignty. Especially at multilateral forum, including United Nations, China was adamant about its own position, that this condemnation of the United States was seen as a priority. I think then we saw something interesting that starting, I would say, on January 8th. What happened on January 8th? On January 8th, the acting president of Venezuela had a meeting with Chinese ambassador in Venezuela. And during that meeting, she committed to continued cooperation with China. She committed to the promise to protect China's interest in the country. I think eventually the Chinese criteria to evaluate what changes have taken place in Venezuela is whether and how it affects China's interest on the ground. And here the core issue is whether what happened in Venezuela constitutes a regime change. If it is a regime change, what that means is our agreements and our commitments made by the previous government could be revoked. And all the loans and debts the government owed China could be written off because it's a regime change. But since this meeting on January 8th, I think China started to get the confidence that this is not a regime change. The acting president is inheriting her power from the previous government, which means that all the agreements and all the commitments made by the previous government are still valid. And that's why the Chinese became so much more relaxed and much more calmer about what has happened. There has been a lot of media sensation about oil. China being the largest loser, the most significant loser in the changes in Venezuela. But from a Chinese perspective, the oil story is not yet clear. But there are reasons that the Chinese can be more confident than people would imagine. Because the oil that China has been getting from Venezuela, it was a part of the repayment of the loans that has been left over since the period of Hugo Chavez. What it means is that one, a good majority of the $6 billion debts, loans owed to China had been absorbed since Chavez's death in 2013 through oil repayment or through payment by oil. The remaining loans are still there. But as long as this is not a regime change, the loans remains to be loans. Repayment remains to be repayment. If they are not made in the form of oil, they will have to be made through other forms, whether it's revenue that the government is gaining through its oil collaboration with the United States or its sales through other means, the loans will have to be repaid. As long as the loans will be repaid, I think the Chinese will consider their basis to be covered. Because coming to oil, we also know that currently the international oil market is buyer's market, right? China does not face a shortage of suppliers. There are cheaper oils, say from Russia and from Iran, that are readily available. Venezuela oil is not a must for China's energy security. But then, of course, for observers who dig deep into what this could mean, there's also a reference to Roosevelt corollary of 1904, which is not a part of the original Monroe Doctrine, but it has a very significant and realistic impact over what we're looking today. And this is an aspect that I feel a lot of people are not talking about. The Roosevelt corollary outlined in the President Theodore Roosevelt's annual message to Congress, it stipulates that if Latin American nations engage in chronic wrongdoing, such as failing to pay debts, the U.S. had the right to intervene. And the goal was to prevent European powers from using force to collect debts. which could lead to permanent prohibited colonization. And that has a realistic implication here, right? If US cites the Roosevelt corollary, like they cited Monroe Doctrine, then people could see that there is a reason that Venezuela does not repay its debt to China's loans, that the remaining 20 billion US dollars that's still owed to Beijing. But here, I think the deliberation is that Roosevelt corollary appeared before Paris Club, and before there was a constellation of international creditors coming together to talk about debt sustainability. So if a country like Venezuela goes default or just declares that we are just writing off the loans that was signed up by the previous government, and this is not a regime change, is inevitably going to undermine the credit rating of the nation and its future ability to raise funding on the international financial market. So it's not a clear-cut answer to the question of that either. Worst come to worst, China back in 2011 lost 20 billion US dollars of asset in Libya because of the civil war. And it was painful and was a very significant lesson for China. But what people realized in the following 10 years was what goes around comes around. When a country goes default on the loans that they owe to China, and in the future, if they still want to get financing from China, and let's also remember, China is such a significant player in the international development finance market that Chinese financing is not something that any country would just easily write off. Just to think about the future implication, I think the Chinese have some confidence that they can negotiate a relatively positive outcome without losing all their assets on the ground.
Yoon, that was terrific. And Sylvia, I'm going to turn to you in just a sec to ask that very question about whether countries like Brazil are willing to write off the support that they receive from China on infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative as a trading partner for largely agricultural and mineral exports. But before I do, Yoon, if you'd permit me to follow up on just one small aspect, which is you've been focusing on debt repayment and on whether China will continue to receive oil from Venezuela. That represents, I don't know, I've seen 1 to maybe up to 3% of what China imports. But what about the role of Chinese companies? And this is also relevant to Russia. There's been some reporting that going forward, the United States will try to exclude oil companies from Russia and China from future projects, even as there's this effort to really stand up once again a really robust energy sector in the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. So I guess my question is, how important from a commercial standpoint is this market going forward? Not looking at debt repayment, but whether China would fight to make sure that its companies can continue to play a role in the energy sector in Venezuela.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There has not been the clarity that the market would like to see, right? Because the policy environment is so volatile that we don't know what is going to come out of it. And I would say that when the Chinese companies, especially, let's remember in Venezuela, a good number of the major players are Chinese state-owned companies, which means that while they're acting on behalf of the Chinese government, they're state-owned. These are national agendas. These are national efforts to engage Venezuela. But it also means that the companies are not necessarily liable for the losses when a raid, something like the US raid of Venezuela, happens. But it does mean that we have seen this across the board, whether this is Yemen, Libya, Myanmar, Malaysia, when the policy environment turns negative. What we usually see is a halt or suspension of Chinese commercial engagement for something between 5 to 10 years until the situation stabilizes. I think the Chinese company, especially Chinese government, they're so cautious about the reputational risk and about the potential loss of their assets. So when there is a significant turn in the political environment, the Chinese default, their position by default is to suspend major engagement in any sectors of the country in question. And there are plenty of examples that have suggested this is a pattern of the Chinese behavior.
Thank you, Yoon. Sylvia, sometimes when we talk about the role of China and Russia in Latin America, we talk about it in kind of big, international relations ideas, whether Brazil and others want multipolarity and want to diversify their relationships. But Yoon has talked about some very practical things that China offers countries like Brazil, right? Investment for infrastructure, financing for a range of government priorities, and of course, this enormous market for exports. Do you get the sense that the US is not poised to replace China if, in fact, it persuades countries to move away from that relationship? Or am I incorrect? Is there a sense that maybe the United States is offering more than kind of an effort to intimidate countries to move away from China and Russia, but real material alternatives to whatever it is that Russia and China provide in places like South America?
I think both of your theories are right. There is this concern about the huge influence of China in many countries, from Bolivia, Ecuador. They are everywhere. Peru with the new port of Shanghai. Brazil, that has been like rebelling at some point, talking a lot about multilateralism and not using dollars for everything. And you saw what Trump did with Brazil, imposing high taxes. Now they are lowering down after a lot of negotiations. So I think the United States are doing a lot of what they can do to prevent China to be so present here in South America, in many countries, not only Brazil. Brazil is the main economy. So, but you also see that Trump changes his mind very quickly. So a few months ago, the son of Jair Bolsonaro was in Washington doing a lot of lobby with Trump, for Trump to pressure for the release of Bolsonaro. And then after some diplomats and some businessmen came to Trump and said, look, things is not exactly like this. Bolsonaro is really a thief. He changed his mind. So this is happening with a lot of frequency. And the same thing just happened in Colombia. Trump was saying Petro was the next one with this exact words. And I happened to arrive in Bogota when I was back from Caracas, and I saw the not only the manifestation against Trump, but also could follow some background about how Petro's diplomacy and Colombia's diplomacy managed to make him change his mind, because Colombia would be a very much more complicated country to intervene. It has a huge army, and so I think the United States are looking a lot at their what they used to say their background yard. No, and China is everywhere. It's something very, 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 very powerful economically. But I would say I just want to make an observation, because we are talking a lot about what's going to happen with the Venezuelan regime. The regime is still there, it's not there. But I think something that I felt a lot being in Caracas, and being in Caracas in the next the few years ago, we see a division. I mean, the Rodriguez brothers, Delcy and Jorge, they are very clever people. They are very well prepared politicians. They are very strategical politicians, and they are doing everything that the United States wanted them to do, like to see if they calm down and started to look at Greenland or somewhere else. But there is a more hardcore Chavismo group, Diosdado Cabejo, Padrino, that would maybe prefer some kind of confrontation, and that could mean if this part of the regime wins power against the Rodriguez, they might prefer to call Russia, to call China, to call Iran to help them. That's not what the Rodriguez are doing. The Rodriguez are closing with the United States. So when we talk about Venezuelan regime, we should also think about what's going to happen inside Chavismo, inside what it's left from Chavismo. And these two brothers, they are really very powerful. You know that better than me.
No, it's a super important point, Sylvia, and that's the same, for the evolution of politics and other big actors in the region, right? There's a presidential election in Colombia this year. There's one in Brazil. There'll be one in Peru. And so the result of that election will also be a factor in how the region reacts to the Monroe Doctrine. Thank you, Sylvia, for that reminder and for giving insights from your reporting on the ground in Venezuela. Dimitri, we've been getting terrific questions, and I should remind everyone to keep them coming using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Sylvia mentions the idea of, what's the next target of the Monroe Doctrine, whether militarily or using other tools to affect regime change or to change government behavior. It sounds like it wouldn't be Colombia, as Sylvia mentions. We just had a very productive and surprisingly warm meeting between the Colombian president and the US president. With Mexico, it's unthinkable, though not impossible. But Cuba seems very likely. And I've had a few questions come in about what Russia might actually do in response to this pressure. I mentioned that Russia criticized U.S. policy for, quote, suffocating the Cuban economy. But Russia didn't actually take action to defend Venezuela beyond, critical statements. And so, I think the question for you, Dimitri, is if in fact Russia values the relationship with this particular government in Cuba, what, if any, support might it offer?
Well, thank you. Let me start with a very short story, personal story. I think about several years ago, in 2019, during the previous crisis about Venezuela, I had a meeting with a US diplomat from embassy, and I asked him about the Doctrine Monroe 2.0. It was a joke. I was thinking it was a joke, but he glanced at me very seriously and said, no comments. And I thought it was not funny. And I understand that Monroe Doctrine is a very important thing for the United States. But in my personal point of view, I think that Latin America for the United States is not a goal. It's an instrument for achieving more important goals, to win the competition with China, and to create the system of alliances which can help the United States to improve the situation in the country, in the United States. But speaking about some military opportunities of the United States, I doubt that now it's possible, because what can I say? The military operation in the Venezuela doesn't have popularity in the United States. And I doubt that the Trump administration now is able to repeat some kind of military operation in other states. In Mexico and Colombia, even in Cuba. There are some risks, very terrible risks. But if we are speaking about Cuba, yes, the economic pressure is the very good way for, no, not good, good is the wrong word, but it's very effective way to make pressure on Cuba. Cuba suffers very deep economic crisis, and suspending oil supplies from Venezuela, from Mexico, can lead to humanitarian disaster. And what Russia can do in this situation? I don't think that we have a lot of opportunities. Yes, we are going to continue oil supplies, but we are not able to increase our oil supplies. It's very expensive. There is problem with logistics, and because of this, it's very hard for us to improve situation without any other help. I don't know what about China, if China is ready to increase its oil supplies to Cuba or do something like this. I don't know what about Brazil. Now I doubt that Brazil is able to supply oil to Cuba because of political risks in Lula administration. But I think Russia now is able to negotiate, is able to make some morals report to Cuban government. But what can they do else? I don't know. Maybe some humanitarian aid, which we can do now.
Thanks, Dmitry. You sometimes hear from China analysts that not only might China end up tolerating the new Monroe Doctrine or the Trump corollary, echoing the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but actually approve of it if it also applies to China and China's sphere of influence, and if perhaps it even would justify military action against Taiwan. That is to say, if these rules apply equally to China in its sphere of influence, then maybe this is actually favorable to Chinese foreign policy to have the world divided and to have a might makes right system where there are fewer constraints imposed upon the great powers. Do you see that analysis as, first of all, being discussed in Chinese foreign policy circles? And do you think there's any validity to that interpretation?
Oh, I think there's absolutely the validity to the interpretation because the Chinese think in the ways of reciprocity, right? U.S. wants to prioritize Western Hemisphere. That's great. This is in U.S. backyard, and U.S. should. And that will almost automatically translate into a decrease of the friction point between US and China because China's primary theater is West Pacific. Its secondary theater arguably is Indian Ocean. So the Eastern Pacific is not on China's priority list. That yes, Latin America has its importance for China, whether it's economic relations, whether it is ideology, some would say, or whether it's just solidarity among global souths. Of course, China as a global power will see there's going to be Chinese interests in the continent. But if you ask that, well, which one is the lowest priority for China's foreign policy, if there's a list, I consistently see Latin America and Africa being at the bottom of China's prioritization. So what that means is for China, China will respect if US absolutely seeks and asserts its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, because that's not a fight that China will pick. But remember, we talked about what sphere of influence is, how is this defined? Does that mean that China cannot even be there economically? I think the countries in the region probably will have a negative answer to that too. But by the same logic, I think China also expects US to respect China's sphere of influence. And Latin America's story is primarily about the extent that China can stay and engaged in business. There's no competition with US for dominance from the Chinese view. They will prioritize protection of their assets and will not give up facilities such as the ports without a fight. But what they're trying to do is to argue that Taiwan is fairly and squarely in China's sphere of influence. And if US expects China to respect its own definition, the US should also respect China's definition of Western Hemisphere, I'm sorry, Western Pacific, especially Taiwan, to be a core national interest for China. And that has a long list of implications for the US regional and global strategy, right? But of course, as policy analysts, we also know that double standard is now rare in international politics. I totally see the possibility, and actually, we have seen some of this messaging from the Trump administration to say, well, the same rules don't apply to you. That U.S. is the leader of the liberal world. We always debate about that. U.S. has its own definition, and that definition does not have to apply to China. So that will be an interesting bargain that potentially we will see down the road.
Thank you, Yoon. Sylvia, you've done a lot of reporting, over the last year plus of the new Trump administration. I'm wondering what you're hearing from Latin Americans about this debate taking place about Latin America, but among non-Latin American governments, right? Yoon just said maybe China wouldn't compete and contest U.S. efforts to dominate Latin America in return for U.S. deference to Chinese interests in Asia. But again, the voice that's excluded in those conversations is the voice of Latin Americans themselves, and whether they want to be dominated by any particular world power or whether they'd prefer the non-aligned strategy that became very popular over recent years. So I wonder, Sylvia, what are you hearing? What have been the elite reactions? What have been the reactions among average Latin Americans, South Americans, Brazilians to this assertion of U.S. preeminence?
Yeah, I think in the last 10 years, this kind of idea of being aligned or with China or with the United States have been less popular than before. I think some governments, even the mostly the more liberal governments, they want to make trade and negotiations with everybody. We had a problem with Mercosur 2 years ago when Uruguay decided to open the idea of a free trade market with China, and this would be against the rules of Mercosur. But nowadays, Mercosur changed a lot. Mercosur before was more left-wing group of countries, and nowadays it's more mixed. So these conversations about let's embrace multilateralism. Why not making business with China and with the United States? So everybody celebrated the idea of the Puerto de Chancay in Peru. But we now are facing a North American government, a USA government that doesn't want this. They don't. Our president wanted to make exchanges in many different kinds of currency, and Trump will never let this happen. So he kinds of is forcing again this alignment. I don't think the actual government of Brazil prefers China than the US, or prefers Russia than the US in terms of trade, maybe in terms of geopolitical because of the whole Ukraine war thing. But what I see here is like the reaction against the invasion of Venezuela was very harsh, was very wow. What is this guy is going to do now? What is next? So everybody's kind of afraid of what might happen. But I don't think I think the general feeling is more multilateralistic than aligned as it was in the 70s or the 80s. We really need to make more trade with everybody, and the discussion at Mercosur nowadays is this: we should make free trade alliances like Chile has. Chile has more than 40 or more free trade alliances with many countries, and Mercosur is starting to feel like for presidents like Javier Milei, like Santiago Peña, like something that is just like limited, putting some limitations to us. So I don't see Brazil fully aligned with Putin or fully aligned with China, or neither with the US. But yes, Brazil wants to defend itself against the US because the US put tariffs on Brazil on 50%. And now with a lot of negotiations, we started to lower it down, but a lot of sectors of the economy are suffering from that. And then I think the businessman and even the government will look for China. So I don't feel this ideological way of thinking of the most of the population. Yeah, but regarding Venezuela, I think things more complicated because we are in a country, I just said, Lula won the elections by 1 million votes in a country of 220 million of people. So it's a very close, it's a very polarized country. So a lot of people say, yes, that's the right thing to do. Trump should organize Latin America. There are a lot of people who thinks that in Brazil. But I don't think this would be like the intellectual elite or even the businessmen of Brazil. They earn much more money with Lula than they did with Bolsonaro. They know that. They might say the contrary, but they know that. So it's, I don't think it has to do with being aligned with one way of thinking, but there are some things that scares us. No?
We just have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a forward-looking question for the three of you, and I'd ask just maybe 1 minute for your response, but it's a tough one, which is this an inflection point or not? When we look back at the assertion of U.S. regional preeminence and the desire for China and Russia no longer to be major actors in the Western Hemisphere, will this be a turning point? Or a few years from now, we'll look back and say, largely, as Sylvia pointed out, countries want to be non-aligned. They look for benefits from as many partners as they can. Is this an important historical moment or not? Starting with you, Dimitri, then you, Yoon, and then Sylvia will conclude with your remarks.
Yes, thank you. I don't think that it's a moment which can change everything in our life. I think it's a normal situation, and the Trump administration has its period of has its mandate. We don't know what will be in the United States in 2 years, and 3 years, and 4 years. But Latin American countries they have to cooperate with Russia, with China, with the United States, with all foreign actors. And, for Russia, for example, there is some optimistic signs. What do I mean? Now we are seeing the right government in Latin America. And sometimes for Russia, it's easy to cooperate with right governments than with left, because right governments are more pragmatic and they are able to cooperate to get benefits despite some contradictions, political contradictions or ideological contradictions. Just the same I can say about China. You know that Javier Milei said a lot about China, a lot.
Mhm.
But where's China? China is in Argentina. And I think that we have to see in the real life. And real life says that the cooperation between Latin American countries and China, Russia, Europe, Iran, Turkey will go on. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yoon, 1 minute.
Well, China's engagement is a continuum. It's a trajectory, right? There are some fluctuations, there's some blurbs, but I don't see that the overall direction is going to change that much. Countries are pragmatic, countries seek what is in their national interest. And this unilateral change of position on the US, and let's not even debate its sustainability, is unlikely to affect or significantly or fundamentally change that trajectory. So I would say that we will see some adjustments in the short term, but in the long run, I think this continuum will just march on. Thanks.
Thank you, Yoon. Sylvia, final remarks.
I completely agree with what Ian just said. I think this is how it is, and I think the only difference maybe here in Brazil right now is that we have this Bolsonaro supporters group that are pro-Israel and pro-Trump, just like we have in Argentina as well, and they might be like more vocal in the sense of I'm this in this side or the other side, but I think most of the countries, including Brazil and Argentina, are looking for more multilateralism, and that's what's making Trump so mad.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Let me just thank our fantastic panelists for this conversation. I learned a lot. Dimitri, thank you. This was terrific. Yoon, Sylvia, I hope, the four of us can continue this conversation. And this issue, is not going away, whether or not this turns out to be a major historical inflection point. I want to thank our fellow Juan Peñalosa, who played a big role in organizing this. Two of my other Stimson Center colleagues, Beatriz Garcia Nice from the Latin America program, Peter Sleskin, the senior fellow and director of the Russia program, and perhaps most of all, our audience for your interest, your participation in this event, for the questions that you shared. I didn't attribute them to you, so I took credit for all of those great questions, but many of them did come from terrific members of our audience. So thank you for participating. We'll continue to address this issue, of course, and the implications from the perspective of the region and from other important international actors as the United States dramatically changes its posture in the Western Hemisphere. For now, thank you again. This was terrific. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much for having us. It was a pleasure. Obrigada.